We stare at a blinking cursor on a blank screen, and we expect a blank slate. Society treats artificial intelligence as an objective mathematical oracle. We assume that because the interface is built on code and cold calculation, it must be devoid of human messiness. The reality is that the data feeding these prompts is entirely human. It is saturated with centuries of our history, our cultural blind spots, and our prejudices. Generative models act as uncritical digital anthologies, aggregating the voices of the dominant cultures that have historically held the power to publish and archive their thoughts. The architecture driving this is the large language model, or LLM. These systems predict the next logical sequence of text based on the statistical weight of the billions of words they have already ingested. Because an LLM creates meaning by reassembling existing human narratives, it functions less like a calculator and more like a vast collective text. Auditing its inner logic requires the same critical tools we use to dismantle a novel. We can subject the machine to the rigorous frameworks of 20th century scholarship, feminist criticism, critical race theory, and post-colonialism. A biased response is a sign that the algorithm is working exactly as intended. It is projecting the hierarchies of the human canon into the digital present. Let's test this by prompting an AI to write a Victorian story about a scientist discovering a cure for a deadly disease. The output instantly assumes a male protagonist. The intellectual lead is automatically named Edmund or Arthur. To understand why, we apply feminist criticism. In 1979, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar published The Madwoman in the Attic. They demonstrated how male-dominated classical literature forced female characters into a strict binary. They were either idealized submissive angels or hysterical deviant monsters. We can test this binary by asking the AI to describe a female character in a Gothic novel. The model delivers a trembling, pale girl, solitary and frightened in the darkness, a perfect statistical replica of the submissive angel trope. The AI isn't making a creative choice. It is calculating the density of 19th century patriarchal texts and returning the most frequent narrative pattern it finds. Newer models occasionally generate a rebellious, brave heroine ready to fight. These shifts show that once engineers identify a bias, they can manually tune the statistical weights to favor agency over archetypes. But without that specific manual intervention, the machine's default setting is to erase female agency and center the intellectual male. The tech industry assumes the solution to biased data is simply more data, scale up, and diversity follows. But this hits the stochastic parrot theory. Massive language models actually amplify existing biases, as the loudest voices in the training data drown out everything else. We see this when we prompt the AI to list major American novelists. The generated list overwhelmingly prioritizes the traditional, Eurocentric perspective: Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner. The statistical flattening of the model pushes historical giants off the primary list. Writers like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin are relegated to the margins of the model's first page. Apply an eco-critical lens and ask the model to summarize global environmental crises. The output leans heavily on generic, Western-centric imagery: melting glaciers, polar bears, and rising sea levels. It frequently omits the specific crises ravaging the global south, like the massive deforestation campaigns cutting through the Amazon, or the displacement of indigenous populations navigating severe flooding in the Sundarbans. Larger datasets don't create diversity, they enforce a statistical monopoly of the dominant culture. Bias is not always an accidental byproduct of history. It is often a deliberate engineering choice. This is algorithmic alignment, the process of forcing a model to adhere to specific behavioral guidelines and ideological boundaries. We can audit alignment by asking two different models to write a poem in the style of W.H. Auden's Epitaph on a Tyrant. When we ask the American OpenAI model to write the satire about Donald Trump, it generates the poem without hesitation. The system complies because it operates under a liberal democratic alignment that permits the critique of political leaders, including Vladimir Putin. Then we pivot to the Chinese model, DeepSeek, and ask for the same Auden-style poem about Xi Jinping. The system instantly issues a hard-coded error. It refuses to process the prompt. This alignment goes beyond poetry. Ask this model about the Tiananmen Square protests, and it blanks out the exact history the state wishes to suppress. Algorithms programmed for constructive answers rely on political euphemisms. As Salman Rushdie documented, state-sponsored narratives of beautification often hide the destruction of marginalized slums. When an algorithm is stripped of its ability to criticize power, its alignment functions as a weapon of state-mandated historical erasure. If all human knowledge is constructed from a specific point of view, can any AI ever be truly neutral? Consider how these models evaluate ancient texts. If an AI classifies the flying chariots of the Indian Pushpaka Vimana as mere myth, while treating Greek or Norse flying objects with the exact same skepticism, it is applying a uniform standard. Subjective perspective is an inevitable part of storytelling. Systemic harm occurs only when one perspective suppresses all others and presents itself as a universal, objective truth. When the machine echoes only the dominant voices of its training data, it effectively invalidates the lived realities of everyone else. Correcting this imbalance is a process of epistemological decolonization. This means reclaiming the power to define what constitutes knowledge and ensuring that the machine is fed the data of the marginalized, not just the archives of the powerful. Communities in the Global South must transition from being passive consumers of digital content to active digital creators. The stories, regional knowledge, and histories missing from colonial archives must be written, digitized, and asserted. If we want the algorithm to account for our existence, we have to feed the machine the raw data of our own narratives. The only way to build an artificial intelligence that reflects a complete human history is to ensure every human story is actually in the machine.